we might make a start, and I'll start by introducing our guest speaker today. So firstly, thanks to everyone for joining in to hear from our August SAGE seminar speaker, Dr. Anna Manero. And so Anna is joining us as a research fellow at the Water Justice Hub and is working on water economics and governance. And Anna is part of the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University, but she's also an adjunct fellow here in the UWA School of Agriculture and Environment. And for those of you in the RE group, some of you may have worked with Anna in your when she was here or are still working with Anna. And so Anna's broad research interests include non-market valuation of natural resources, the interconnections between poverty, growth and inequality, and in Safina economics. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Anna as our speaker today, and I'll hand over to you, Anna, to share with us your wonderful talk.
Thanks, Ellen, for the introduction. So I'm working as a research fellow for the Australian National University, but I'm speaking to you from Perth. Actually, I live here. I live in Perth in 𝒂-𝒂 country, and I still have an office at UWA. So if you ever want to catch up for a coffee or say hello in person, I'm always happy to that. So drop me a line. The study that I'm presenting here today was recently published in Ecosystem Services and is a literature review of studies that have conducted non-market valuation of values held by Indigenous peoples. So I could talk for hours on this. And some of you may know a lot around non-market valuation, and I know some of our colleagues in our area are world experts and they know much more than me on non-market valuation. But some others in the audience may have heard this for the first time today or may not be so familiar. So I'd like to get a sense of how much people in the audience know or don't know about non-market values and valuation. So just to make it really simple, if you already are confident with this and you know what this is all about, just give me the thumbs up. And if you're sort of unsure, then just don't say anything. Just give me a reaction in the reaction button. I'll just do a thumbs up, just an example. All right, it's a bit of a, sure I can see that. Hopefully, can you help me, Caitlin, with this? I don't see the reactions. I'm sure people are not reacting or reaction button. Oh, I have a thumbs up from Jeff.
Yeah, they're popping up on the bottom of the screen, but there's a few and a couple of comments in the chat. Some of us have never heard of it and others, I guess, are familiar with it. So I think you've got a mixed bag tuning in.
All right, mixed bag. All right, super. All right. So non-market valuation is generally defined as a suite of methods and tools that environmental economists may draw upon to try to estimate the worth of environmental goods and services that cannot be traded in markets, like things that you can't buy or sell. So for example, if we have a river and that water from the river is put to, for example, to growing crops, and those crops are sold in a market, we can say that the market value of those crops is so much, and it's defined by the market. But other benefits that we derive from the natural environment, for example, swimming in a river, that's not traded in markets, and you cannot go to the market and buy yourself a river, but you can access a river in many cases for free and enjoy it for your recreation, for whatever other use. And there's not necessarily a financial and monetary transaction involved in it. So environmental economists want to understand what the value is of these goods and services that the environment provides that don't have a market price. So how do we do that? So there's many different ways, and typically they are based on observing either people's behaviors or people's preferences. So for example, they can observe how often people visit a site. This is a picture of the Ocean Reef beach in Perth. So for example, if someone wanted to understand what the value of this beach was, they could see, or they could ask people, how often do you come to this beach? How far did you travel? They could look at the house prices close to this beach and compare those house prices with an equivalent home that it would be further away. Or they could also ask hypothetical questions to people living in this area or people also living far away about a potential change to the environment. I think what is important to remember around non-market valuation is we are talking about a change, and typically this is a marginal or a relatively small change. We don't usually use non-market valuation to measure, for example, the value of the whole Himalayas. We don't do that. We look at, for example, the value held by people who benefit from that side of a marginal change. For example, in this case would be if that beach was to be eroded by climate change, or part of that beach was to be lost due to sea level rise. For example, the council could ask their residents, how much would you be willing to pay extra in your taxes so we could develop a program that would protect this beach from being lost, that would reduce the risk. So we're talking about a change in the environment, a marginal change. So this could be a contribution for protecting something that we already have. But also non-market valuation can be used as a way to understand the values that people have for things that may be lost. So actually in this side, there's a new marina being built, and the marina will certainly bring a lot of other values. It will generate jobs, and it will generate money going to the local economy, and people will have the boats, and it will have some enormous benefits, I'm sure. But at the same time, there's things that are going to be lost. So the people who used to go to that beach to go surfing or to walk the dogs, they won't be able to do that. So there's a trade-off between what we are losing and what we are gaining. And some of those losses and some of those gains will have a market price, and some of those losses and how those gains will not have a market price. So most of this is just tools in valuation around that concept of willingness to pay to protect something, or willingness to accept if you were to offer a compensation, and those trade-offs between what you're gaining and what you're losing. Is this up to here? It's relatively easy to understand, but these tools become very delicate when we are trying to use them in the context of the values held by Indigenous peoples. So these pictures here show the Darling Barker River in Barkanja country, and we can see the Wilcannia Bridge in two very different situations. So as the river goes drier, as the water quality gets degraded, then the values that Indigenous peoples hold that are linked to that river also change. So there's songlines, there's traditions, there's culture, there's education, it's a source of food, it's part of that river is part of country. So when that river suffers, the values that Indigenous peoples hold linked to that river also are suffering. So a big question is, if we have these tools in non-market evaluation that are useful and are valid to understand the changes that into people's values associated with those environmental changes, can these tools also be applied when we're trying to understand and the impact to Indigenous people's values? So theoretically, yes, but there are a lot of challenges. But despite those challenges, there's many studies that have applied these tools, and these are the studies that we have reviewed in this literature review. And they have many applications. When done properly, it can be a very effective and valid tool to progress a number of goals. And for example, there's a news that I just read this morning, and there is a proposed fertilizer plant to be developed close to the Dampier in Western Australia, and that is going to affect some sites that have a high cultural significance, predominantly for the rock paintings. So there's obviously people who are going to be impacted, whose traditional and cultural values are going to be impacted by the development of this plan, and there's proposals to move some of those paintings to another side. Some of those paintings may be lost. So there's a question whether all those peoples whose values are going to be impacted, do they deserve a compensation? And if they do deserve financial compensation, how much should that compensation be? So not in this case, because this is quite new, but there's been other studies in the past, not only in Australia, but in Canada and other places where non-market valuation has been useful when done properly to assess the worth, or to try to associate a monetary figure to changes to Indigenous people's values. So it is not only a theoretical exercise, but it can have practical applications. The problem when developing these practical applications is that Indigenous peoples often hold ontologies that are very different to the ones held by people typically living in Western societies. And there's a lot of limitation in these non-market evaluation methods that they clash with the ontologies and ways of understanding the world by Indigenous people. So, for example, some of these values associated with what we call the environment, associated with country, they can be considered sacred. They're untouchable. So Indigenous peoples may not even want to talk about trade-offs, may not even want to think about losing or seeing those values impacted. They're just untouchable. So how then do you do evaluation on a change that should not be happening? And in many cases, the land, the country, the waters is and will always be Indigenous. So why are we talking about changes that should, in the first place, should never be happening? It can be quite confrontational. It is a very valid question. Also, some of these values are not necessarily about what we see as benefiting from the environment. Like, I go swimming in a river and I benefit because I get, I love being in the water. I feel healthy. It's good for my, for my well-being. It sometimes, and in this Western conceptualization, we look at the environment as a source of benefit for us. What goods and services can we extract that benefit us? But this is not how many Indigenous peoples see the world. They value the country, they value the environment for the relationship they have with them. For many of these ontologies, everything is connected. There's not such a thing as just taking. It's all a connection, and an impact that's happening in one part of the ecosystem will have a repercussion somewhere else. And so when we're trying to develop these surveys around like trade-offs, would you be willing to give this up in exchange for that? It's very hard to develop these tools when we're talking a value system where everything is connected, everything is related. Another point of conflict between the traditional economic theory and many Indigenous ontologies is the idea of that more is better. In economics, we have this concept of utility maximization, which means that as an individual, I will act rationally to bring myself more benefit. So I want more money. I want a bigger house. More is better. But this is not necessarily the case for Indigenous peoples, where they may have like a strong tradition of sharing and giving, and also understanding that taking too much is not necessarily a good thing. We should only take what we need, not what we want. So this idea of paying less and then receiving more does not necessarily sit well with Indigenous ontologies. Another challenge in applying non-market evaluation is that we often use a payment vehicle in the form of dollars or whatever currency is relevant to the location. So we often ask people, how much did you spend? How much would you be willing to pay? How much in dollars, in a financial value? But some of these communities live in settings where it's regulated by the customary economy. Money may not hold a strong place in the vision of the world. It may be something that they don't use very often if they have another way of organizing their society. So asking about trade-offs in terms of money or dollars may or may not really be relevant in some cases. Also, sampling can be challenging. Often in non-market evaluation, we try to have large samples that are representative of the population we want to study. But in Indigenous context, sometimes these communities are very small. And so the methods that we typically use really don't have a lot of what we call statistical power when we actually only sampling a very, very small group. Also, for a number of very valid reasons, these people may not even want to talk to researchers. They don't want to participate in the survey because of the nature of the survey, because of how the questions are being asked, because of how the results are going to be used. So traditional surveys where we either ring people or send them an email and say, "Can you please answer this set of questions?" They just simply do not valid. They're not even appropriate in Indigenous context. So then how would we do evaluation? Another challenge is around the fact that a lot of these values are held collectively. It's not about maximizing your own individual utility, but it's about the good that this environment brings to your community. And also there's differences within a same community. In many cases, the knowledge and the opinions of the elders or the women or the men or some particular subgroup within the community may have more weight in how the environment should be cared for. So when we do a survey across the whole population, should we give more weight to those who have more knowledge, those whose voices are the ones who should be heard, or should we treat each individual as one response, which is what the traditional methods do? And also, how do we aggregate responses from different subgroups? They could very well be different communities, different indigenous communities who have different values, they have different value systems, they have different priorities. And so when we do a survey, do we look at an average? Do we look at them separately? And if there are many different opinions and priorities within that sample, then that also becomes challenging to aggregate the responses. But despair not. Despite all these challenges, there's been many good studies out there that have actually done norm-mark evaluation to better understand Indigenous people's values. And this is what we reviewed in this study. So I carried out a systematic literature review of the peer-reviewed studies across the world. I didn't set out a time limit, and I searched for keywords in the 3 main search engines: GStore, Web of Science, and Scopus. I found almost 600 results to start with, and after removing the ones that were duplicated and not relevant, and looking at the ones that had been referred to in the reference list, I ended up with 63 results. One of the reasons why so many of those 600 were not relevant is because although they did respond to the keywords around Indigenous values and valuation, very few actually carried out an empirical work. Very few did the actual valuation. A lot of the works were discussing values, were doing mapping exercises, were describing the values. And another set of studies were critiquing norm-mark evaluation or supporting norm-mark evaluation, or more like a professing and discussing. But I only found 63 in the peer-reviewed, literature that actually did norm-mark evaluation, looking specifically, or as part of the study, looking at changes in the environment that are important for Indigenous peoples. Most of the studies that I found, out of the 63, almost a third, 19 were based in Australia, and another 20 or so came from Canada and the United States. So this is indeed a very strong geographic bias, and I think that one of the reasons is because it is indeed in these countries, Canada, the United States, and Australia, that the importance of Indigenous people's values to inform policy, to inform environmental management, is increasingly being recognized. So it's not only being recognized by the academic community, but also by policymakers. And thankfully, there's some resources that are being devoted to these sort of studies, although we probably could have more. There's other areas of the world that were also highly represented, like Central America, and others like Africa and South America were a bit less. When we submitted the paper through peer review, one of the reviewers commented that it could be due to a language bias. Could be the case. There's most of the academic journals that are peer reviewed, they only publish in English, so it could well be that the knowledge that is generated from these regions where English is not the main language, they either not publish or they only find their way to the grey literature. So there is, we do acknowledge that there is a geographic bias, but nonetheless, there's some very good lessons to be learned from the studies reviewed. We looked at whose values were being considered, and we found that indeed 24 out of the 63 studies surveyed and had a conversation with the Indigenous peoples themselves, the people who were affected by that environmental change. So they understood what the values held by Indigenous peoples bind it. So the impact on Indigenous peoples' values from the perspective of Indigenous peoples. Another group of studies were surveying and understanding the changes from the perspective of the local population. in most cases, the local population included Indigenous peoples, but it could also be people who do not identify as Indigenous. So there's some studies who did an interesting comparison, find some statistical differences between those survey respondents who identified and did not identify Indigenous from the perspective regarding the same resource, the same river or the same forest, the same resource from two different perspectives. And we also found another group of studies that survey the general population. So this is quite interesting because they survey the general population of most of the time of the country in question, but about a value about environmental change and impact that was not directly affecting the people responding to the survey. So it's valuing an impact on Indigenous peoples, but from the perspective of someone else. We also looked at what type of values were being questioned, whether they were direct use or indirect use or non-use. And the difference between these is that direct use values are the ones that the person who's responding to the survey is directly benefiting from. They could be for consumption, for example, for foods, or non-consumptive uses, for example, recreation or swimming in a river. So 23 of the studies looked at direct use values. Then another large number, 19 studies looked at non-use values. So those are values that people hold, but they don't use. So typically they're altruistic values. So I think I hold a value I want to preserve. I would be willing to pay to preserve an extra bit of forest land, for example. Although I'm not using it, it's a non-use for me, but I want to protect it because I think someone else will benefit from it. That's an altruistic value. Or because you think that you just value the existence of that environmental feature. And then there were another group of studies that looked at multiple values. They either did not define the values specifically, or they looked at a combination of both direct and of direct use, indirect, and non-use values. I also did a more fine classification. I know you cannot read the slide, but it's there. It's in the paper, which, by the way, is open access, so anyone can download it and have a good read. So we did classify the papers with I fine-combed all the papers that I found, and we classify them by the type of use and the type of value, and also the type of ecosystem service, whether that was a river, a forest, a wetland, or whatever. So there's a lot more detail in the analysis than I present here, but as I said, the paper is there for you to download and read at your own pace. So what we wanted to do with this paper also is not only recognize the challenges and do a classification of the studies found, but we also want to do some lessons learned. So out of all the papers that we reviewed, we found some strategies that the authors had used to try to either handle, bypass, or overcome those limitations that we discussed initially. And there's no silver bullet. Like, non-mark evaluation in the context of Indigenous values will always be challenging, but following some best practice, it can be done, and it can be done properly. So one of the ways that we found was, and this could be very obvious, but it was not always present, was a direct and ethical engagement with the people affected. And I'm here noting a couple of the articles that we found that made particular use of these strategies. There's many more, and it was not the purpose of the review to critique or cherry pick best studies. We just looked all across the studies and found the strategies that we thought could serve as lessons learned in the future. So as I said, direct ethical engagement is pretty much the first stepping stone in any study. So it's important to consult with the people who are affected, to know what values are being impacted, and also whether the study is appropriate, whether even someone should be even asking these questions, and whether the Indigenous peoples who are affected really want these studies to go forward. And if they do, how can their voices shape and determine how these studies are carried out? We find another group of studies who, because the difficulty in defining the impact, defining the value, when these values are relational and they all interconnected, is they define some broad-based values. They didn't really explain what the impact was. For example, they said, would you be willing to pay to protect X number of water holes that are important for Indigenous peoples, without going into the detail whether those water holes were important for food, for education, whether it was a song line. It is a way of, of encapsulating all those values without necessarily having to define and dissect what that value, what an environmental future means. There was one study that I found interesting that looked at the health outcomes, and this is, technically speaking, it's not a non-mark evaluation, it's not a welfare measure, but it did try to translate in dollar values the benefits that Indigenous peoples derived from being around country. So this is a study in the Northern Territory where they looked at the health outcomes in I think it was 5 chronic conditions, and how the people who spend more time on country benefited more from the time on country and had better health outcomes. And then the economic part comes when there is evaluation of how much those benefits in health outcomes mean in terms of dollars. So that's, again, it's not a welfare measure, but it is. I did find it very interesting how the authors were able to put a link between the spending time on country and a monetary figure. Other studies looked at market-based pricing, and again, this is technically not non-market evaluation because they're actually looking at the market price of the goods. These were a few studies, some of them conducted again in Northern Australia, where they looked at how much fish and other river species were being caught, and what would be the equivalent in terms of the price as foods if they were to be bought or sold at a market. So again, it is technically not a non-market evaluation, but it is another interesting way of trying to understand the worth of a resource that is important for Indigenous peoples. Other studies looked at bequest values, which are values that are held by the person who's responding to the survey, but not for themselves, but for future generations. One of these studies was carried out in, I think it was in Madagascar, and they asked people about their willingness to pay to preserve the fish stocks, but not for themselves, but for future generations. So in a way, this also removes the difficulty in assessing those values that you don't want to accumulate for yourself, or they're collective in nature. So it's a way of taking the heat off, asking how much would you want the fish for yourself, but it's embracing that idea of altruism and for future generations, which seem to work better in this particular context. Other studies looked at non-monetary payments, and what I mean by this is that the payment vehicle, when we ask people how much would you be willing to pay or how much would you be willing to accept as compensation, they were not necessarily in dollar terms. There were other forms of exchange. Some were there there was one in bags of rice. There was another one in your time. They asked people how much would they be willing to contribute to a project with their own time, and not necessarily with the dollars. Another study looked at fuel. They said, we were to conduct this project, and would you be willing to accept a payment in fuel to run your boat, and then they could use the boat for fishing or whatnot. So again, it has some technical limitations, so it uses these elements that are not money, but it is another way of overcoming this limitation, and especially in contexts where the community is organized more around the customary economy. And a lot of the studies, as I just mentioned before, is that they sample the general population. And again, this is another perhaps effective way of trying to overcoming all those limitations of applying non-market evaluation in Indigenous context, is as the general population of a country where a particular environmental feature exists that is important for Indigenous peoples, and as a general population, what do you think about this? So in these cases, then we're not dealing with the problems of relational values or accumulation, because we can apply pretty much standard methods to the survey when we're sampling the general population. So once we looked at the limitations, we identified ways to handle these limitations. We also try to pave a bit the way forward, and it's not for me or any of the authors in this paper to tell anyone what to do, but what we did, instead of providing this straight recommendation, is we just listed a set of 7 key guiding questions that we think will be useful for ourselves in the work that we are doing at the Water Justice Hub, that may be useful for others. So sometimes you can't find the right answers if you don't ask the right questions. So we started by asking ourselves and inviting others to ask themselves, when you're doing or thinking of doing a non-mark evaluation study in the context of Indigenous values, right? What is the purpose of the evaluation? What are you going to use the information for? Is it simply to fill in a knowledge gap? Is it going to influence policy? Is that information going to be useful for Indigenous peoples, for example, in litigation cases or in compensation? Do you have a valid reason? And if you don't, then there's hundreds of other methods available to understand and recognize Indigenous values that could be applied. So, and if you have a valid reason for doing this sort of study, then who is going to benefit from the research? The researchers themselves, policymakers, or are Indigenous peoples themselves going to benefit from the research? And again, there's no right or wrong answer, but I think it is important to have that question up front to really shape how these studies are done. We also invite people to question whose values are being considered. So if you're looking at environmental change that is impacting Indigenous peoples, are we then considering the opinions and the perspective of those Indigenous peoples themselves or the general public? At the end of the day, if the general public holds very strong altruistic values, there's many reasons why these should also be taken into account and inform policy. Or no, should we not listen to the voices of peoples who are not impacted? Again, there's no yes or good or not good answer. It's just questions that can help in the definition of these studies. And what is the expected change? I think this is a really important question. In some of the studies that we reviewed, they did not necessarily really define what the change was. They described the situation, but it is a good practice in all non-mark evaluation studies in general to really define what's the change being measured. Otherwise, you don't really understand the change and what that change really means for the people affected, then the responses that people give can vary widely. So we also think that it's important to question and to make sure that Indigenous knowledge is taken into account when we are developing these studies. So we want to invite people to think of how Indigenous knowledge informs non-mark evaluation. What values are being considered, what change, and what are the impacts of those changes. And throughout the process, it's critical to consider what ethical frameworks are we going to use. We typically abide by the ethical frameworks of the country where we are operating, by our university, but also what ethical frameworks apply to the particular Indigenous context that we're working in. And finally, how are the limitations of non-mark evaluation going to be handled? We know it's not a perfect tool. It can be extremely useful and extremely valuable, but it needs to be done properly. So, and we have outlined in this paper some key limitations that I believe should be acknowledged, and when done properly, they can be overcome in a very successful manner. So to follow up on this study, we wanted to understand what the impacts of these non-mark evaluation studies were. So we ran a survey across the authors of the studies that we reviewed to ask them what this study is useful, were there any impacts, would have done things differently, because we wanted to understand, although these studies are a really interesting exercise. At the end of the day, going back to our questions, what was the purpose? Well, what was the impact? Did anything happen after these studies? So some of the authors kindly responded to our questions and did provide really good insights, saying that yes, indeed, these non-mark evaluation studies of values of Indigenous peoples, they had been helpful in informing and making those values count for benefit cost analysis in conservation policies, in management plans of water, forest, and other environmental features. These studies had also been useful in quantifying the losses, and this information was used in mediation cases, and also had been important in raising community awareness and also in gaining government support for Indigenous enterprises. So at the end of the day, non-market evaluation is a very powerful suite of methods, and we can derive enormous knowledge using it. It is very delicate when done in the context of Indigenous people's values, but it can be done properly, and in doing so, there's many positive outcomes that can be gained. And at the Water Justice Hub, we are doing more work in Indigenous space, and we often say that the best things in life are priceless, but they hold an immense value. And at the Water Justice Hub, we want to make those values count.
Thank you very much, Anna. I was just trying to get my reaction button and the clapping there. And there's lots of, if you can't see them, there's lots of claps and hearts and reactions coming up from people online. So yeah, thank you for a really fabulous talk. I have certainly learnt a lot from having absolutely no background in this whatsoever. So it's really great to hear about the power of non-market valuation. So thank you very much. So for those listening online, feel free to unmute yourself to ask a question of Anna, or you can type it into the chat. I see that Steve has already popped one in there. Steve, would you like to ask your question live, or would you like me to read it out?
No, that's fine. I can do this.
Yeah,
right.
Off you go.
Something caught my attention at the end, Anna. So anyway, thanks a lot for your talk. As you know, I'm very interested in that topic, even I haven't worked in it. But there's one question I wanted to ask was, you said if non-market valuation or the limitations of non-market valuations are handled properly or well or something correctly or something like that, I'd like to ask you, what have you learned regarding the handling of the limitations of non-market valuation in an appropriate manner for these kinds of applications? And are there any recommendations that seem to come out from what has been done so far?
Thanks, Stephen. Yes, so what we've learned is there's no silver bullet, there's no magic way of making those limitations disappear. But we did find in the various studies, like different strategies. I didn't find one study that was able to overcome all the limitations. But the different studies, depending on the context and the needs, they were able to overcome some. So that's like the summary that I put together. So some of them, the studies, for example, they, as I said, they sample, for example, the general population, and that is a way of overcoming the problem of relational values, of non-accumulation, of Indigenous peoples rightfully refusing to participate in these sort of studies. We're saying, well, if that is very hard to do, why don't we ask the general population, what do they think about this value? For example, there's now new fertilizer plant that's being proposed in WA. We could run a survey to the general population saying, hey, this is happening. Did you know that they're going to destroy some paintings, or some of those paintings may be relocated? What do you think? Would you be willing to pay to leave that site as it is? So it can be a valid way of overcoming those limitations. And there are others where they decided that we want to know the opinions and the perspective of Indigenous peoples themselves, but we are going to engage directly with them. So there was one study, 𝑧𝒈𝒐𝒍 and 𝒂𝒑, for example, where to understand the differences between individual and collective values, they ran the survey in 2 rounds. So first they asked people individual questions about their preferences, then they had people debating around their personal and collective values, and they ran the survey again. So they were able to understand how the collective thinking and collective values affected the way that people would respond to the survey.
In any of this work, is there collaboration between, I suppose, economists and anthropologists, for example?
I don't know what the field of research of all the authors were. I did look at all the authors list because we did that follow-up study, and I know where they are based. I don't know what the field of research were. I did find a few that were like in I can call it like biology. So we're looking at, plant conservation and fish species. So there was a lot of like physical scientists collaborating with economists. I can't remember the top of my head finding anyone who was an anthropologist, but it could well be.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really good question. And I guess following from that, I have a quick question that I'm going to throw in as chair of the seminar. So I've been thinking a lot about, you've made a really good point for the importance of the market valuation, but I guess how do we get that in some respects more valued from a market perspective, where you've got competing interests of, say, a mine site wanting to go ahead and there's huge economic benefits there. How do we, I guess, what are your thoughts on getting non-market valuation and Indigenous knowledge, I guess, elevated up that sort of stakeholder platform? Are there any examples that you know of where there's been big community sort of pushback on the proposal of a project that has economic value for a region, where it's competed with, local values?
I think the market versus non-market value discussion is it's like a heavyweight against the lightweight. We're talking about two ballpark figures. And when in the survey that we ran or asking people about their policy impacts, one said, yes, the work that we did was effective in elevating that discourse and advocating for better environmental management. But the market benefits of the mine were like so huge that, well, if you're comparing dollars and dollars, you potentially setting yourself up for a very skewed, very imbalanced, comparison there. But what non-market valuation can do is for me, it's a translation exercise. So we have things that they cannot be bought or sold, that are intangible. So when you're talking in an environment where dollars is the currency, dollar is the language, it's a way of translating into something that people can understand in a language they understand. Like, oh, this is important for songlines. Well, people said, collectively that holds a value, it's worth this much. Okay, now that rings. It's a way of making it easier to understand, and I don't think that like the figure, the number per se can be used in benefit cost analysis, and the numbers are important. But as you said, I think it's a way to elevate those voices and those discourses that needs to go hand in hand with other ways. We must have the appropriate legal frameworks around land tenure and Indigenous rights that need to go hand in hand with appropriate valuation. And there's also advocacy. So there's different ways that exist that can contribute to greater protection of Indigenous people's values, and non-market valuation is just one in a bigger picture.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's certainly, I come from a field of looking at, carbon cycling in ecosystems, and we're talking a lot at the moment about putting a value on biodiversity, for example. And so how do you value, if we go into a carbon accounting system where you've got a monoculture forest versus a forest, or a system where you've got lots of species richness, but the monoculture might have higher carbon content than the more species diverse system. And so how do you then put that value on the biodiversity aspects? And so what you've presented, I think, has a lot of crossover or translation into that sort of field as well. So yeah, thank you. It's a tricky challenge. Steve, sorry, definitely. You've got your
No, and I think also, as I said, the legal frameworks are really important. There's some cases where it doesn't matter the number. It always has been Indigenous country, Indigenous land. So in some cases, not even be appropriate to do non-market evaluation. So like, it's out of the question. The dollar figure is not important. This is and always will be. So there's contexts where it can be applied properly, but it's not a one size fits all. And yeah, I think we should, once we reach those numbers, we really should know why we got there. That's why we had that first question, like, what is the purpose of the valuation? What are you going to use those numbers for? And now those numbers going to backfire, because that's a question, like you said, like, what if you do evaluation and the number comes out like being quite modest? Does that then mean that those values can be disregarded? So that's something that should be carefully considered.
Definitely. I'll go to Steve first. You've had your hand up longer than you, Judith. I can see you just raised your hand.
Oh,
Steve?
just a quick comment on what you just said, Anna. The numbers actually could matter, provided that you do your, you balance the market values of mining dollars and the non-market values that are another different kind at the right scale. And I want to take an example of the 1990s when I think it was Shell exploiting petroleum in Nigeria, and really was destroying the ecosystem, the river ecosystems there, and thousands of people who were really being affected. If you're looking at only the local populations, the willingness, the values for, it obviously wasn't going to be able to compete with the dollar's value, which is also a lot of value, right? But in fact, it went international. The people in Holland, where Shell is based, basically boycotted all the products of Shell. Also in the UK, France, and other countries. All of a sudden, there was balance for balance. So you have to say that indigenous cultures are a bit like endangered species in a way, in some cases, and they could have worldwide value. Other people, there's a second level valuation, are valuing what the indigenous people value. Also happens a lot for the Brazilian indigenous people who are being, destroyed by the current economic activities in Brazil. There's a lot of support from around the world in various ways. So if you go down that scale, and of course petroleum or whatever it is, it's being iron ore also has a value for the whole world, but the distribution of that value is very different. It goes mainly to a company or a group of companies. So you have to, if you're going to do that kind of exercise, you have to respect the scale, and the scale is global. It's worldwide. It's not local only, because otherwise, obviously, you're comparing apples with oranges.
Thanks, Stephen. And Steve is much more an expert in market evaluation than I am. And
I'm not. No.
You make an excellent point of the distribution. And this is something that I'm really interested in inequality, as Steve knows, in inequality and distribution of goods and money and resources. And this is something I didn't see coming across strongly in the studies that I reviewed, is who holds those values and how those values distributed. So you could have a particular change in the environment that generates huge benefits, but those benefits are held by one company or a very small group of people. And maybe you have the impacts that maybe in the money, in the worth are less, but they're shared, they're spread. So the cost, the burden is spread across a larger number of people. And then policymakers need to make an informed decision around not only the whole value, the dollar figure, but how are those benefits and costs being shared, and who benefits, and how many people are benefiting, how many people are feeling the negative impact. So I think it's a really valid point that we should not just compare dollars and dollars, but also look at all those other contextual questions.
Yeah, definitely. Judith, did you still have a question?
Yes, thank you. Phenomenal talk. I find it very, so I'm not an economist, I'm a plant geneticist, I'm a crop scientist, and I find it very interesting how you have chosen to tackle the question in a non-judgmental manner, but rather one that is about learning what is out there and what is possible. So I really, really appreciated that you ended up with questions rather than recommendations, because I think in the examples that, for example, Stephen have given about different locations and different problems, including Brazil, etc., there are so many factors to consider, and some are global and some are local. And I do remember when, from the global perspective, Europeans were saying that South America or Africa should remain how they are for their own benefit. But in fact, they have forgotten to ask those people what is their opinion. So I think from that perspective is I like the way that you have invited people to reflect and then be honest with those reflections. So that was really good. Now, my question is, sorry, I don't want to hear myself talking. My question is, there are studies on the IP of nature itself, because as you say, these are languages and modes of communication. So if some people speak in dollars, we will speak in dollars. And if some people speak in values, we will speak in values. We should be able to translate so that we are always invited at the table of the conversation. And there are legal studies that are trying to put forward the rights of nature. Have you come across those when examining the guardianship of that IP by the indigenous cultures? Is that work on legalizing the IP of nature and giving a right to nature still on in conversation in your experience on water?
Thanks, Judith. Thanks for the kind comments and for the question. Yes, indeed, there's more. There's a lot of studies and a lot of people are working in this space. I think it started in the Manero River in New Zealand, and there's other places in the world that have recognized the rights of rivers. And I don't know whether there's been the rights of other environmental features, but they could be. I know Dr. Erin O'Donnell is an expert in this field, and she's in conversations with the Water Justice Hub. So this is something, and other Indigenous scholars as well have a Dr. Anne Paulina, who is also a collaborator at the Water Justice Hub. She's a woman from the Fitzo Mara Water River, and that's something that also is on the expertise and interest of Anne. I cannot speak for nature. I cannot speak for Indigenous values. So I know that these studies exist. It's law is not my area of expertise, but yes, it's something that we know that exists, that we are considering. But I don't know more about it, and I would rather not comment on something that is not my area of expertise. But yes, we acknowledge that that is important, and as I said, legal frameworks are tremendously important, and they need to go alongside other tools. So it could be cases where non-mark evaluation is not appropriate because the local community wants to pursue the protection through granting legal rights to that particular river or that environmental feature, and that's perfectly valid. So as you said, it all comes down to the Indigenous peoples and what the best way of caring for country and protecting the environment is for the future.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith.
Thank you. There's Jojo has asked a question on a clarifying point in the chat about how to preserve unique cultural forms such as obtaining goods only on an as needs basis when balancing supporting Indigenous businesses. Feel free to chime in here, Jojo, if I have not got your comment particularly well articulated. So I guess it's like balancing.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I just thinking maybe the business things and this industry is very competitive, and their original cultural things is not competitive. They just obtain their needed. So I think this different culture. So how to protect their own cultural forms when support the local business in indigenous business like these things.
Thanks. That's a very interesting question. I think it all just comes down to the particular community, the particular individuals, and the ontologies at the local level. We've come across a few cases in this review and the work at the hub where there's not one homogeneous opinion amongst the Indigenous people. Some people say, well, look, the world is changing. This is the market economy. This is our land. This is our resource. We should make the most of it. So yes, why don't we just embrace development and reap the benefits, whereas other people within the same community say, no, this is sacred lands, these are sacred values, we should not touch them. It's more enriching to leave the land as it is than to exploit it for what we can extract from it. So there's, as we said, and this is one of the limitations that we found, is that again, the aggregation of responses. How do different opinions, the people who are seemingly from the outside, they seem to be belonging to the same group, but they actually, their priorities and the values and then the perspectives, they can change dramatically, even at the small scale. So yeah, I don't have an answer for that. I guess, as I said, it just depends on the particular location and what change is on the cards and whose values are being considered.
Thanks, Anna. Any other questions for Anna before we conclude for the day? Yes, Ursula.
Thanks, Caitlin, and thanks, Anna, for a great presentation. I'm interested, obviously you talked about bequest values, but I'm interested in if you came across other ways that time preferences in that valuation were addressed, considering Indigenous ways of knowing time can be really different to how we conceptualize time in the West.
I couldn't really get where that question came from.
It was from Ursula.
Ursula. Oh, that's it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. To be honest, I didn't see a lot of discussion, or none that I can remember, that accounted for that difference in time, and whether future, like, how the economies usually discount values that are going to be gained in the future. I think that those two studies that looked at bequest values, I can remember them discounting future benefits, but in terms of conceptualizing time in a different way, I can remember that being a theme across the studies that I reviewed. But if you have any thoughts, I would be really interested in hearing from you.
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess it's just interesting to think about how we might adapt our strategies, for example, like discounting over time, to be more considerate of different ways of knowing or conceptualizing time is just one example. So yeah, I'd be interested to have a read further myself into that.
Okay. Thanks.
And Anna's just popped the link to the paper in the chat as well. And so in the interest of time, I'm going to conclude there. If anyone else has any further questions for Anna, do feel free to get in touch offline. And I'd like to thank you, Anna, on behalf of everyone listening today, and on the School of Agriculture and Environment, for giving a truly excellent seminar. So thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks.